In a nation scarred by years of civil war, the rapid collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime in December 2024 marked a pivotal turning point.
All of these different anti-government groups realized that this is the time to strike against the regime.
The Islamist terrorist group, HTS, once linked to Al-Qaeda, led a swift 11-day offensive that toppled the government, seizing key cities, including Damascus. However, this power shift unleashed a wave of sectarian violence, with reports indicating that over 1,000 people have been killed in recent clashes, predominantly from the Alawite minority. Christian communities, too, face heightened threats under the new liberated Syria, with incidents of violence and kidnapping causing widespread fear. As HTS consolidates its control, the nation teeters on the brink, with international observers expressing deep concern over the escalating humanitarian crisis and the uncertain future of Syria. Independent journalist Collin Mayfield was in Lebanon with Hezbollah when he learned of the Assad regime's collapse. Collin grabbed his gear and crossed into Syria just as HTS seized control. Mr. Mayfield witnessed and recorded Syria during these initial chaotic days. He visited the Damascus public hospital and saw corpses with evidence of severe torture, presumably recovered from Sidnaya prison. He encountered survivors from Sidnaya prison at the Ibn Sina Psychiatric Hospital who were severely traumatized. And of course, he visited Sidnaya prison, notoriously known as the human slaughterhouse, where he encountered evidence of extensive torture, extreme abuse, and female birth control pills.
I'd be dead within a month if I were ever imprisoned in Sidnaya. It was horrifying to see the conditions that they were in.
Collin even documented the Far Palestine prison, notorious for sexual violence against women. Collin, thank you for taking the time to share your far-ranging Syrian experience, from Captagon drug factories to encounters with ISIS and HTS militia at Assad's presidential palace. This interview is truly historic. Collin, so in my head, I have this image of you. You're in Lebanon, bombs are dropping, Hezbollah is around in certain neighborhoods. You have ceramic armor, all this photo equipment. Somehow you're like a calm within this storm, but there is chaos. And then you're learning that the chaos level is escalating over the border in Syria. How are you hearing about that news?
So I'm always checking my phone. I'm looking at the news every single day. And I remember being in Lebanon, seeing the news that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, launched an offensive from their stronghold of Idlib in northwest Syria, and they attacked Aleppo, and that happened right as the Israel-Hezbollah war ended. So it immediately, it was one conflict beginning as another one draws to a close, or rather a frozen conflict heating up again as a conflict across the border is coming to a close. And we're just watching the rebels push further and further south from Lebanon, just checking the news every day and seeing, after Aleppo fell, Hama fell, and then they were heading down to Homs. So we're just all glued to our phones, glued to Twitter and the news, just keeping up with the troop movements that are happening in Syria. And by the time it was looking like Damascus was going to fall, we started having a serious conversation, my colleagues and I, about whether or not we would attempt to cross the border and go to Syria. And then when Damascus, when Assad did flee Damascus, and Damascus was like completely taken over by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it was in that moment that we decided, immediately we need to go.
So HTS really was very strategic about its timing. It's my understanding that they really saw the opportunity as a result of the activity that was occurring I think predominantly through Israel's army, right? Like you had a situation here where multiple things weakened, right? Hezbollah was weak, Hamas was weak, the Iranian armed military was weakened also by Israel, and then all of a sudden, and then Russia was weak because of what's happening in Ukraine. So they saw it as an opportunity to move from what is it, like the north of Syria down south, right? Is that
Exactly.
how it effectively worked?
Exactly. They've held this autonomous area in Idlib for nearly a decade now, and I mean, it seemed like the civil war was frozen, but like you said, because their enemies, being the Syrian government and Hezbollah, were depleted because of the Israel-Hezbollah war, and Russia is obviously bogged down in Ukraine and not able to provide nearly as much support to Assad as it had previously. So yes, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and all of the wider rebel coalition, they saw this as a moment to take out Assad. So after Hayat Tahrir al-Sham launched their offensive on Aleppo and then captured Aleppo and then started pushing south through the Syrian heartland, other rebel groups started pushing towards Damascus and getting involved as well. So, for example, after Aleppo fell in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds, the YPG, they captured Deir ez-Zor from the regime. They captured the regime positions that were there. Uh, the Southern Command in Dara pushed north towards Damascus. So everybody, all of these different anti-government groups realized that this is the time to strike against the regime.
And then, of course, Israel saw the opportunity too, right? Israel went in and
Exactly.
started really, really bombarding what
Exactly.
they saw as potential areas of threats to Israel and just like took everything out, right?
Yes, in the week following Assad's fall, the Israelis launched hundreds. It was over 600 airstrikes that they launched across Syria in the week after Assad fell. I remember those first few days in Damascus, just being in my hotel, and at about 4:30, 5 o'clock, those first few mornings, uh, just on the horizon from my hotel window, you could see the sky lighting up because there was a Syrian army airfield that the Israelis were bombing. And yeah, as soon as Assad fell, the IDF made very clear that they didn't want any of these weapons, uh, be they chemical weapons or long range missiles, to fall into the hands of HTS. So yeah, as the regime collapsed, the Israelis did all they could to destroy any military infrastructure that could potentially be used against Israel. And the other thing they did was the Israelis invaded southern Syria. So after the Yom Kippur War ended, the United Nations established this buffer zone in between the Syrian part of the Golan region, or Quneitra government, and the Israeli-held part of the Golan region. Because as we all know, in 1967, Israel captured the Golan Heights and has claimed it as a part of Israel ever since. But since 1974, there's been a buffer zone separating the Israeli part of Golan from the remainder of Syria. And the day Assad fell on December 8th, the IDF crossed into the buffer strip and started expanding. Now the Israelis have taken the entirety of the buffer strip in between, Syrian Golan and Israeli-held Golan, and they've pushed out past that. So that was one of the things I did while I was in Syria. I went down to the Golan region, to Quneitra governorate. I went to this town called Quneitra itself, so the city of Quneitra within Quneitra government. That's where I actually ran into some Israelis who were building a position, and they very sternly but politely told me to turn around and go back the way I came. But if anything, they seemed more surprised that a random American was in the buffer zone than they were hostile for sure.
Colin, I want to back up for a second. Let's go all the way back up to Idlib and HTS. And if you can, I'd like you to just check my understanding of the facts because I could be mistaken. So when I see videos, current videos of Idlib, it looks like, and this again is the area that HTS was running, they were operating.
Yes.
It looks like it's a city that is still in good condition. It's not war torn, and it looks like it's a functioning city. I saw cars and commerce and people in the streets. It looked relatively normal. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I'd say so. I've not been to Idlib, but I have many friends who have, and Hayat Tahrir
Yeah.
al-Sham has been governing Idlib effectively for many years now. They have municipal structures in place, be they traffic police or ambulance services,
Yeah.
and they have been serving as a government in the Idlib region for quite a while now. It wasn't too much of an adjustment for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to go to governing all of Syria because they already had that experience of governing Idlib. But admittedly, Idlib is a much smaller region than,
Right.
the majority of the country that they now control.
So let's give my audience an understanding as to where HTS came from, how it was born, because I understand the roots of the organization, of the entity, are interesting, and in many ways plays into where we're going with regards to Syria's future vision. So can you talk a little bit about HTS's leadership, where it came from, and what the forward-looking vision is, and then we'll go back into like the other cities that they went after at that point.
So HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is led by this guy named Ahmed al-Shara. Now, Ahmed al-Shara has previously been known as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. That's what he has been most prominently known for. But Jolani, his name coming from Golan or Jolan, the region of Syria that was taken by Israel in 1967. So Jolani, or Shara, as he now prefers to be called, Shara had, quite an interesting career to say the least. He was, first he was affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So he was with Al-Qaeda in Iraq after the United States invasion, and he was ever so briefly imprisoned by the United States. And then he was briefly affiliated with the Islamic State of Iraq, but he didn't want to swear allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS. So the people under Jolani instead swore allegiance to Zawahiri, and Jolani's group became Al-Nusra Front, which is widely considered to be the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. After al-Nusra Front, there was the rebrand as Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, and after Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, we have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is what we have today, and which is the largest group in Syria right now, and it's who Shara is the leader of.
So
Now,
that's a tough
yes,
background, right? I mean,
it,
that is no joke.
Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, al-Nusra Front, and now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But Jolani has, or now Shara, because he
Yeah,
doesn't
when
like
did
going.
Jolani change his name? I didn't even know that happened.
So he prefers to go by Shara because Jolani was his nom de guerre when he was affiliated with Al-Qaeda and Islamic
I see.
State. And now that he is a, reformed jihadist, you could say, he says he's not, and he argues and has said many times in interviews that he is not nearly as radical as he was in his youth. He's no longer looking for global jihad. So he's been trying to rebrand himself. Now, whether or not anybody believes him, that's your own judgment call. It's your own discretion. But he is at least trying to do that public relations of he wants to at least appear reasonable. So he's stopped going by a name that is confrontational toward Israel, and instead just uses his given name. And yeah,
But people didn't they call him on the streets because they thought that was like a positive nod to Israel? They called him Jew Lani.
I've actually heard the opposite. So it's critics who have called him that, saying he doesn't go hard enough on Israel. And regardless of what Jolani or what Shara may or may not think about Israel, I don't think calling him Julani is fair. I don't think he's a Mossad agent. I think he's not an idiot, and he sees that Hezbollah and Hamas have been crippled, and you probably shouldn't have Israel as an enemy. That's why the Syrian government has had very, very little to say about the Israeli incursions in the south of Syria.
So is he saying the right things in your opinion right now, to take control of the country and to try to create ongoing control, ongoing stability? Is he saying the right things as it relates to what I think the international community and media would like to hear?
Most certainly. I'd say he's a fairly good public speaker. He's been very good at getting his points across, and he's been good at the rebrand. He no longer is wearing fatigues and a keffiyeh around his head with a big burly beard. Now it's a suit with a tie and a trimmed, neat beard. So he's done a lot to rebrand himself for this like neoliberal Western world order, and it's a lot more appealing to the West. I mean, you don't have
What are the appealing talking points? Like I see the visual that you're painting, but what are the talking points? How have they shifted from being like radical extremist jihadist into, oh, he's a softer, kinder
well,
leader?
for example, after the HTS takeover, there were a number of incidents that were documented where religious and ethnic minorities were attacked. Like there was a Christmas tree in Hama that was burned, and Shara gave an interview after the fact, and he said that yes, after the takeover, there were some abuses committed by members of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham where ethnic minorities were persecuted or attacked. But these were not orders of HTS itself. It was just individuals working for HTS. Again, whether or not anyone believes him, that's a personal judgment call. But the fact that he is trying to say that there will be accountability for people who hurt ethnic and religious minorities, and Shara went on to say in that interview that these ethnic groups and minorities have been in the region for thousands of years, and that nobody has a right to displace them or extinguish them. So just those statements like that show that they have the West in mind the way old school Al-Qaeda never would have.
Well, Collin, is there anyone historically that you could think of that's gone through this type of rebranding, both physically with regards to clothing and shaving, et cetera, as well as messaging? I mean, it's incredible what he's doing, right?
I'm trying to think of another good example from history of somebody who's gone through that many looks. I mean, the only other world leader I can think of who's gone through as many looks is Jolani is Trudeau, but his are costumes. Whereas, Jolani had his transition. First, it was your stereotypical Islamist militant with the long beard and keffiyeh, and then he started dressing like Fidel Castro. When he took over, when HTS took over Damascus, that's how Shara was dressed. When I saw him on December 8th, ever so briefly, in Damascus on that very first day, that's how he was dressed in his Fidel-esque fatigues. And then after, is the move to the suit. So yeah, it seems to have been quite the successful rebrand.
So Collin, when you say you saw him on December 8th, I know we got to get back into the timeline here, but this is your first day in Damascus, and
yes.
Where are you? And like, tell me what's going on. Like, let's bring that image to life for a second.
All right. So
I admittedly, like when you told me this story the first time we spoke, this was just fascinating to me. It's like all of a sudden, like this light shines on this moment where you are, and you're seeing, the leader of HTS right next to you. So where are you? How did this happen?
It was insane. So December 7th, of course, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is on the outskirts of Damascus. Early morning, December 8th, Assad flies to Latakia, then flies to Moscow. After that, HTS enters the city. So at the point that HTS is entering, that's when my colleagues and I in Beirut are debating to go, and we pretty quickly decided that we were going to make our way to Syria and leave. Crossed the border, didn't make it into Damascus until late that night, and
Where'd you drive? You drove in?
Yes, we drove. We had a car. A friend of mine in Lebanon has a car, so we all went in her car. So we arrived into Damascus late that night, and one of the few hotels we were able to find open was the Golden Mesa Hotel. It was a very expensive luxury hotel, and after checking in and dropping our luggage off, a few of my colleagues and I went to the hotel bar and decided to grab a drink. and we were there for a few minutes, and then hotel staff comes in and they start pushing all of the tables in the bar into one really long table. And then the hotel manager comes and says, "I'm very sorry, there's going to be a private event, so we need you to leave the bar." And we were a little bit confused about that. It's like the government just collapsed and somebody's rented out the bar for a private event. We were a little bit perplexed by that. And after we got kicked out of the bar, my colleague Yigoda Grondetska and I went outside for a cigarette. And all of our luggage and camera equipment was unfortunately in our rooms. So she and I are outside having our cigarette, and then a bunch of HTS fighters walk out.
How do you know they're HTS? Like, what is it?
Their uniforms and patches on their shoulders.
Okay.
And after a while, they start coming out. There's about 15, 20 of them. And we're just watching them come out, and then Shara walks right by Yagoda and I. He was like 5 feet away from him. We just looked at him. He looked at us, and he got in his car. They all drove away, and I couldn't believe it. And I went inside and I asked the concierge. I said to the concierge, I was like, "Is that who I thought it was? Is that who I think it was?" And he was like, "Yeah, that was Jolani." And so apparently after the takeover, they had a little private meeting in the bar of one of the nicest hotels in Damascus. And I was fortunate enough to have been there.
When you see this guy, are you terrified? Are you fearful when you see this group of
No, of
people?
course
Like,
not.
you're not scared at all?
No,
Should you
no,
be scared? Should you
no,
be scared?
no. They want to look good to the West. They're not going to harass some random journalists, especially not somebody that important. I mean, a foot soldier at a checkpoint might harass a journalist, but people like that are not going to be an issue. I mean, I wasn't concerned about it. I was just in shock at seeing somebody who has that much power and sway over history. I mean, somebody who has incredibly shaped the region for better or worse, too soon to say. Regardless, somebody who has, gravely impacted history just walked right by us. I was just dumbfounded by that.
Do you know anything about his background, Collin? Like, is he educated in, like, it sounds like he comes from wealth. Like, did he have a Western education of sorts, or what's his story?
He was born in Riyadh and grew up in Saudi, but his family is from Syria. Family has a little bit of money, but I don't remember exactly what he studied while he was living in Syria. But after the the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, that is when Shara adopted the nom de guerre Jolani, and that Second Intifada is what he said radicalized him. So that's really where a lot of his story begins.
I see. So when we painted the picture earlier of Idlib, the thing that was interesting to me was then when HTS went through these other major cities, a lot of them were already disaster zones, right? They had been like subject to war and battle and bombings and whatnot. Like, would you say it was tough for HTS to move in and take, some, I know these are like major cities in Syria, but it seemed like their infrastructure was just so decimated at that point. Do you think it was difficult for HTS to walk in and take control?
No, I don't. And my reason for that is, they mostly used I think it's called the M5 highway, and it's that highway that connects up and down in Syria. It goes from Damascus all the way up to Aleppo, and they took that highway just straight south. And in a lot of instances, like for example, when Hama fell, like there was fighting in Aleppo over a few days, and there were airstrikes conducted by the Syrian Arab Army and the Russian army, but neither of those were able to dislodge HTS, and ultimately Aleppo fell. So when they start going down the M5 towards Hama, the SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, they retreated from Hama further south to defend Homs, and so like that city was taken with very little fighting. And I mean, really, Assad's army crumbled without a whole lot of resistance. I mean, in many places, soldiers fled. I mean, you have to keep in mind this is a civil war that has been going on for over a decade, and we all thought of it as being frozen. HTS has hardened ideologues fighting for it, people who are motivated by what they believe in, people who have traveled all the way from all over the world. I mean, I saw Uyghurs and Uzbeks and Tajiks while I was there.
Wow.
Meanwhile, Assad had conscripts. So he didn't have a very motivated force, and it very quickly evaporated with the speed of HTS's advance.
How did Assad get out? How did he get into Russia?
So it's not entirely sure, but so Assad flew from, in the middle of the night after the city surrounded, Assad flew from Damascus to Latakia on the coast, and then from Latakia, it was I want to say it was a Russian flight, a Russian jet, but it was a flight from Latakia to Russia.
What do you think will happen to Assad? I know that he's, in his posh penthouse in Moscow, but what do you think ultimately is going to happen?
The same thing that happened to the Shah, die in exile. I don't think anything. I think his story is done. He's just, the rest of his days are just going to be like Shah Pahlavi in the capital city of the country that once backed you until you die.
That's incredible. Do you think Syria is in a better position with this new government now?
It is far, far too soon to say. I mean, there are too many variables at play. It's like, will HTS try and implement some form of Sharia in Syria that a lot of Syrians are not happy with? Because Syria, especially like Damascus, has been, historically relatively secular compared to like other parts of the Middle East. Like, so whether or not if they want to implement some type of Sharia, that could cause difficulty. I mean, we're already seeing rumblings of pro-Assadist militias that are against HTS, like in this southern suburb of Damascus, Jamarana. There's been unrest there, unrest to the point where the Israelis have threatened to come and provide security and like resolve the situation. I think it's far too soon to say. I think can Shara even hold together his own group of people? I mean, he might be moderate enough to allow for, liquor stores and bars in Damascus, but some of his more radical underlings certainly wouldn't be. So there's already been, cracks of bickering like within HTS's ranks. So I do think it's far too soon to say whether or not Syria will be better or worse, but what we can say for sure is that Assad was absolutely brutal to the people of Syria. And for a number of people I met who suffered under the regime, they said they don't know whether or not HTS is going to be good or bad, and whether or not the future is going to be good or bad, and if Syria is going to be free or continue to be in war. But what they do know is that at least one tyrant is gone.
What a crazy, crazy situation. So it's December 8th. I have this vision of you guys like jumping in the car in Lebanon, taking like a road trip. You just like cruise over the border. I'm sure there was like no check for passports or anything like that.
On the Lebanese side, yes.
And then you just cruise,
exit
right?
stamp for Lebanon, and then past that, there's nothing. Just empty, abandoned checkpoints on the Syrian side.
Wow. So you cruise into Damascus, you have this moment, but then you're like, here you are, you're in Damascus and everything is going, totally wild, upside down, like complete chaos. Wake up in the morning. Where's the first destination? What did you guys want to cover first? I know there was so much in the news then. Where do you go?
Immediately, we all went to Umayyad Square, which is a central roundabout in Damascus, and there are tens of thousands of people gathered, both civilians and militants alike, to celebrate the fall of the Assad regime. So there was a statue of Hafez al-Assad, who is Bashar al-Assad's father, and Hafez was the dictator before Bashar succeeded and took power after Hafez died in 2000. But like there was a statue of Hafez that was pulled down in central Damascus the night before that they were dragging through Umayyad Square behind a truck. Celebratory gunfire. So many men were shooting their AKs into the air. There was even one technical that was shooting its belt-fed machine gun from the back of the truck into the air. So that was interesting to see, but just tens of
It must have been
thousands of
relaxing.
people. It's celebratory gunfire, so everyone's just happy. Nobody's worried about it. I mean,
Tens of thousands of people are on the street, gunfire in the air, and it's just normal.
dozens of guns, though. I mean, most of the people there weren't armed. Most of the people there were civilians celebrating, but HTS was definitely shooting their guns in the air. And, the militants will pass their guns around and let kids get pictures with them. I saw that in Lebanon as well. But so you'd see like lots of like Syrian teenagers like holding AKs, getting the pictures taken with HTS in Umayyad Square, and everyone was just celebrating the fall of the regime. So this first few days were just, it was a lot of ecstasy as everyone was just celebrating the fall of this Ba'athist regime that had been there for 50 years that nobody ever thought was going to leave. I mean, keep in mind, the Syrian civil war seemed like it was coming to a close. It seemed like Assad had won, and in 2023, the parts of the international order even welcomed Assad back. I mean, it's like the Arab Spring was so long ago. They let Assad rejoin the Arab League in 2023, or rather, the Arab League allowed Syria to rejoin in 2023. So it's just out of nowhere. It was completely unfathomable for everybody there just a week before.
So tons of emotion. What about the Syrian women? Were they in the streets too?
Of course, yes, plenty women, and like I touched on earlier, Damascus is historically a lot more secular than a lot of us in the West might imagine. So, I mean, after the takeover, we started seeing, as time moved on, we started seeing more and more niqabs. But a lot of the women that live in Damascus are just going to be hair uncovered, no hijab. I mean, some wear hijab, some don't, but it's not uncommon. A lot of women in Damascus were secular minded and Western clothing. So,
Did you have a chance to talk to any of the kids that were taking photos? Like, I'm curious from their perspective, if you had the conversation, did they have the understanding as to like what was, there was revolution in the streets, right? There's like maybe a new type of freedom, perhaps. Did they understand that at all, or were they just part of the masses?
the younger children I was able to speak to, not really, just because there was such the language barrier. But as far as, you know, college students, people in their early 20s who most often did speak English, I was able to talk to a lot of them, and they were just explaining just how ecstatic it was because they'd felt like they'd had a boot on their throat for the past decade or more, for their entire lives. And again, it seemed completely unfathomable, and all of a sudden this dictator who had been there for years was gone. So everybody I spoke to who was old enough really understood the significance of it, and everyone seemed excited.
Colin, did you speak to anyone at that moment who perhaps had friends, family in some of those prisons, those terrible Syrian prisons?
So not that first day at Umayyad Square. I ended up going to Sidnaya 2 days later. I went to Sidnaya, which was called the Human Slaughterhouse. It was one of Assad's most infamous prisons. So I did meet survivors from a few of Assad's prisons, but again, not that first day.
So when you went on, I didn't know the name, the Human Slaughterhouse. I mean, that is just so gruesome and terrible. So 2 days later, when you go into, I guess let me back up, because again, the mindset of it is so fascinating to me. So you make this decision. You obviously know about it. It was all over the news, but you make this decision that you want to go and visit the Human Slaughterhouse. You hear that it's open, right?
Yes.
And do you have any reluctance, or is there any fear? Is there any concern on your side about going there?
Again, not really, because this is the kind of thing I've done before, and it was just
Amazing.
going to a liberated prison. So there really wasn't anything that occurred at Sidnaya that was, scary or anything. I mean, it was sobering for sure. It was a very somber place with absolutely horrifying conditions. But I mean, it would be terrifying to be imprisoned there. I mean, I know I'm being as sickly as I am. I'd be dead within a month if I were ever imprisoned in Sidnaya, but it was horrifying to see the conditions that they were in.
What was it like when you talk about the conditions being horrifying? Let's talk about like the physical conditions first, and then from there we can
Okay.
extend into possibly like the different types of devices and
Okay.
contraptions that you saw.
All right. So there were a lot of so Sidnaya had prisoners both above and below ground, and it was those below ground cells that were the particularly disturbing ones. Just really small, cramped. The floors are wet, and your shoes are getting wet. It reeks. There's urine and excrement on the floor. All of the squat toilets are just overflowing with sewage. It reeks. The air was hot and thick, and the entire place smelled of death. You'd see roaches and bugs in the cells and graffiti that people had clawed into the walls. Some people were held in solitary confinement without seeing light. Others were more fortunate, but it's just that prison broke so many people. There's one anecdote I read shortly after the prison was released where there was a man who thought that Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, there was a man in the prison who thought that Hafez and Hafez's rival Saddam Hussein finally went to war. Saddam won, and Saddam was liberating him from Sidnaya. And this man got the rude awakening that no, Hafez has been dead for 20 years, and Saddam as well. So just some people just had absolutely no grasp or bearing on reality when they got out. There was this one man who was arrested, there was this one man who was liberated who the only word he could utter was Aleppo. Like the HTS guys that rescued him would ask, where are you from? Aleppo. Where were you arrested? Aleppo. What's your name? Aleppo. And I I remember I went to Ibn Sina Psychiatric Hospital and I met two patients from Sidnaya, one man and one woman. And the woman was childlike, but she could speak. But the man was completely disoriented. He was skittish and scared, and he couldn't speak a word. He couldn't say anything, and he had welts on his wrist where he was handcuffed and suspended, just hanging by his wrist for long periods of time. So his wrist was swollen up because of it. And he had like little lacerations across his arms and wounds that looked like cigarette burns. But like I said, I mean, he couldn't speak. He couldn't explain what had happened. And when hospital staff tried to show me this man's wounds, so they pulled his sleeves up, he got really visibly distressed by that and just recoiled at having his wounds exposed.
It's
But
amazing.
I mean, we found, like in the women's wing of the prison, we found a packet of contraception pills on the floor, which it doesn't take much inferring to know what that has to mean. Yeah, I mean, there was rampant
Just
sexual abuse in
rampant
Assad's
rape.
prisons.
Yeah.
Horrifying. I visited another prison that was run by Assad's military intelligence directorate. It was called Far Palestine, and in the Far Palestine prison, there were a lot of survivors who. There were a number of survivors who testified to like the European Council for Human Rights, and they were saying how like in Far Palestine, like gang rape was incredibly common, and for women, it felt as if like sexual assault was part of the booking process. I mean, at Far Palestine prison, women were just raped upon their arrival to the prison. I mean, it's just the worst of atrocities. I mean, we saw corpses in the Damascus public hospital that had been recovered from Sidnaya, and uh, some of that, like you could count their ribs. All of these men were starving. You could see their ribs So many of them were missing eyes. Some appeared to have been gouged out. There was one man I saw who appeared as though he'd had his skin flailed off because there were different parts of his skin. Some were only about like 4 inches by 4 inches, others like 4 by 6 or 10, where it just looked as if skin had been peeled off of his body. There was another corpse I saw that had been recovered from Sidnaya that was castrated, and it was just horrible things. I mean, so many people recounted torture in all of these facilities, be it being doused with boiling water or having a tire placed over you so you're immobilized and then being beaten with pipes and extension cords. There was one man I interviewed who was arrested, and he told me how there was a concrete wall in the prison that the guards had glued broken glass all across. And what they would do is they would throw inmates into the wall.
It's just insane. Just totally insane. What about torture devices or like when you were in these prisons, did you see any types of tools or anything that also highlighted how the prisoners were being tortured?
So they didn't get nearly as medieval as I would have expected. From both what I personally heard from survivors and what I've read from like different human rights groups that have published reports, a lot of the torture was more rudimentary, like being beaten with extension cords, or I remember reading about one man who was stabbed with graphite pencils, and then the guards would break the pencils while they were still in his flesh, so bits of wood and graphite would be stuck within him. So it's not like they had a lot of high-tech torture equipment that they were using. It really was a lot more like rudimentary stuff. Like just holding somebody down and putting cigarettes on them.
Yeah.
But there was one device that I think you're about to
Yeah,
get
this
to.
is
There's one device I did see, and that was called colloquially it's been called the Pancake machine.
Yeah,
And it was a hydraulic press big enough to fit like 1 or 2 people in it. And we heard a few different things from people after the prison had been taken over. So one thing that I heard was that the hydraulic press was used for executions and torture. Another thing I heard was that the hydraulic press was used to crush bodies to get like moisture out of them, so it'd be a lot easier to dispose of, or crush the bodies so they would dissolve in acid more quickly. So those are the couple of explanations that I heard for the massive hydraulic press that was found at the prison. And I will say this much: the room where the press was one of the most foul, disgusting smelling places. I mean, it just smelled like rot.
That's like just so horrific. I can't even imagine. I mean, is that entire experience not just the image, but the scent, that smell of
Oh yeah,
death as you describe it, is that like permanently embedded in your memory?
there's a few of those. There's a few of those smells that I'm not gonna forget. Be they from Ukraine or Syria or yeah. There's I'd say humans have a more distinctive smell than say like a dead raccoon.
Is this the most horrific experience that you saw or experience? Is this the most horrific I'm at a loss for words, to be honest with you. Like, is this the most horrific thing that you witnessed or saw in Syria and Damascus, or was there worse? Was there worse?
I don't think you could top Sidnaya. I mean, just given because it wasn't all, we saw it cumulatively in one place. It's like the corpses we saw from Sidnaya who had been clearly tortured. We saw those at the public hospital in Damascus. And I mean, like I said, they had bits cut off of them or cigarettes put out on them. And then, but I would just say, yeah, Sidnaya was definitely one of the most disturbing places that I visited in Syria for sure, just given the sheer amount of death and torture that occurred there. And I mean, I met survivors. I saw some of the victims. It definitely one of the more disturbing parts of the trip for sure.
Yeah, it's so wild. So, Assad turned Syria into a drug peddling type of machine too, right? With Captagon, I know that he was building, manufacturing, and distributing Captagon not just throughout the Middle East, but it started to permeate into Europe and I understand also parts of Africa and beyond. Um, did you stumble across Captagon manufacturing facility, or did you go
Oh,
looking for
quite a
that?
bit. We went looking for it. So shortly after, the day after I went to Sidnaya, I was reading about the main Captagon facility that the regime used. It was in this place called Duma, which is on the outskirts north of Damascus. Now, in Duma, there's a massive Captagon facility, and the regime always claimed that that plant in Duma was making soap, but everybody knew it actually made Captagon. So HTS captured the Duma facility uh, like December 7th before they were approaching Damascus. And I visited the Duma facility on December 13th. So here, uh, the Assad regime was producing Captagon, which is an amphetamine. It's similar to speed. So for anyone in the audience who might have taken Adderall or Vyvanse before, uh, allegedly, imagine taking 2 or 3 30 milligram Adderalls, and allegedly that would be about what the average Captagon would feel like, I would say. Yeah, I mean, the Assad regime, it genuinely was a narco state. I mean, they produce like 80% of the world's Captagon, and I mean, estimates vary, but it's estimated that the regime made like 5.7 billion annually from Captagon production, and they had smuggling routes like into Lebanon, and from Lebanon you can go further. I mean, they'd go to the Gulf states as well, and so it's just permeating throughout the Middle East. And like you said, it's spread out of the Middle East. But I mean, it's definitely one of the most popular drugs there for sure.
You think HTS will resurrect that business?
Oh no, they've promised to destroy Captagon production.
Do you believe them?
It's too profitable.
Exactly.
What, they're going to
Exactly.
take all of this equipment and not use it? I mean, the market has just collapsed. I mean, 80% of Captagon production is gone, and some enterprising entrepreneur is going to fill that void, and HTS already has all the resources for it, but that would be haram. Drug production is haram, and they have publicly said that they are going to stop the flow of Captagon and destroy remaining Captagon production. And I think if they do want sanctions relief, it would be wise of them to do that.
Where do you think the ingredients comes from?
I remember that one bottle of manufacturing components. I don't remember what it was exactly, but there's this one bottle I saw that was manufactured in the UK. Where the manufacturing components come from, though, I can't really say.
Did any of your friends try it?
Yeah, allegedly, a lot of us did.
And
And it's how I'm able to compare it to an Adderall. But like I said, HTS has said that they're going to destroy the pills, and then off camera, they may have turned a blind eye to various colleagues of mine from different outlets taking it. I mean, it's kind of an open secret. A lot of people did try it, and a lot of people were trying it, and HTS kind of looked the other way if any foreign journalist was gonna pocket a couple of pills, which certainly a few did.
And there you go. So, it's pretty wild when you start to think about the build, like the infrastructure of Syria. I mean, it was like a brutal regime. People are being tortured. Hospitals are filled with mentally ill people that are byproducts of a brutal regime. What type of industry was left? I mean, if you look at the images of some of these major cities that you're talking about, they're all decimated. So what is going to come as it relates to commerce in the future?
Now, that I am no expert on, but I mean, there's just going to have to be a lot of rebuilding to happen. And another thing that is worth considering is, the role that Israel plays in this, because a lot of land that agriculturally has been, very profitable for Syria, a lot of this very fertile land in Syria's southwest is currently in Israel's crosshairs right now. So, I mean, there are too many variables for me to predict, like what industry may take hold in the future.
Didn't Netanyahu just say that he was going to go into Syria to protect the Druze?
Yes, yeah.
You heard about this?
There's been, that was the pretext I heard Netanyahu give was to protect the Druze, and as far as the Druze as far as the Druze go that I've like personally met. I mean, Lebanese Druze that I've met, I know a handful of them who are, anti-Israel. Syrian Druze I met were more divided. Some of them expressed to me in private that they'd feel more comfortable being with Israel. Others expressed more publicly, of course, that no, they wanted to be part of Syria under HTS. I remember we saw this one video. I saw this one video of a Druze man in Syria saying that he and his community would be better off if they were under Israel. And this was in this region of Syria called Hadar. It's near Mount Hermon. And I asked this Druze, Mokhtar, who's like an elder, like a village elder, I asked him about that, and he said that that was absurd and that no, that, we would not be better off under Israel, but rather we want to remain under Syria. We are Syrians. So Drew's opinion seems to be divided, but what I will say is that when I asked all of the Syrians I asked about the Israeli incursion, when I was in like the Quneitra region, which is the part that, Israel invaded on December 8th, all of them, a lot of the people I met said that the IDF soldiers they interacted with were Druze. So it does make sense on the IDF's part to send Druze soldiers to an area that has historically been Druze. So that did make a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, a lot of Druze were against HTS during the Civil War, and even though there were Druze militias that fought against HTS, now they're saying that since HTS is in control, they want to recognize the current legitimate government. I mean, this was the sentiment that like the Druze leaders that I spoke with in Hadar shared with me. But I guess we'll see whether or not the Israelis do go all the way to the outskirts of Damascus to protect the Druze in that area. Like we'll see.
Well, it's kind of interesting though, because if you think about it, your comment, if there was like a glaring form of commerce coming out that HTS can leverage for monetary purposes, you would know it. You were on the ground, you would see it, right? There's like no publishing industry, there's no Hollywood, they're not creating, new forms of emerging technology. You would know it, right? So I guess the question is, what happens to HTS, which has roots in terrorism, which has roots in religion, and wants to keep control over all of Syria, if they don't have the money to manage the property, the real estate? What happens to HTS? Like, what are they gonna do to make sure that they can control and manage an infrastructure that's sustainable?
Well, one thing that I think that they would rely on would be that same thing that the Assad regime itself relied on. So the government that exists in Syria now, which after a while they did start calling themselves the Syrian Arab Republic. I found that interesting. So my first press card that I got issued in Damascus after the HTS takeover, it said it said Syrian Salvation Government on it. And about a week after that, they started calling themselves the Syrian Arab Republic, which is the same name that the Assad regime went under. And aside from Captagon, one thing that the Assad regime relied on a lot for funding was its oil fields in the east of Syria, like in the area around Deir ez-Zor. And this is going to be something that a future government would look towards. I mean, you definitely want to be able to have these oil fields and be able to profit off of that, or be able to like purchase cheap oil from the Syrian Democratic Forces, because that's one of the ways that like the autonomous administration in the northeast makes money is by selling its oil to the rest of Syria. So I think we'll definitely see a lot more of that, as has been the case already.
Do you think HTS will think in terms of creating some sort of a caliphate? Do you think they'll want to expand beyond Syria?
No, I don't think so. Because, I mean, they wouldn't have joined HTS if their intention was global caliphate. Because, I mean, keep in mind, these are a lot of these people who, were former al-Nusra, like, already had their Islamic State affiliations, and they decided they didn't want to be with the Islamic State. So, like, I mean, Shara declaring allegiance, with al-Nusra and not IS. So, I mean, just their past actions indicate that they're not looking for some cross-border caliphate. I mean, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has said that their focus has been on Syria. I don't think it's unrealistic to say that we might have some type of Islamic State in Syria, similar to like the Islamic states that we have in like Turkey and Saudi, for example. But I don't think at all that a cross-border caliphate is on the table.
So something a lot more moderate then.
Most definitely, and I don't think that the Turks would allow that either. I mean, Turkey has been very quick in establishing diplomatic relations. I mean, I remember seeing in the news that there was an MIT, which is that's Turkish intelligence, for those who don't know what MIT is, but there was a Turkish intelligence official who was in Damascus meeting with HTS in the days following the Assad regime's fall, and Turkish Airlines and Qatar Airways were like competing with one another to see who could get the first flight to Damascus. So I don't think that Erdogan's government would be too keen on an IS-style caliphate to the south. I think they're definitely wanting the more something a bit more restrained.
Collin, Americans are often criticized as truly like not understanding the nature of the Middle East. What would you say Americans should know as it relates to Syria today?
It's a very fragmented country. The Northeast is, for the most part, still controlled by an autonomous zone. It's called the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also called Rojava. That is going to be a point of contention in the future. So this autonomous zone, it's governed by, a mix of Kurds and Arabs. Critics will say it's a Kurdish ethno-state. And the United States maintains, troops there. I think it's about 900 troops that the U.S. maintains there. Meanwhile, other parts of Syria are under a completely different political administration. So, like, when Assad's Syria fell, on the ground, the situation in, say, like, Qamishli didn't change that much, because it's a Kurdish city, or Kurdish and Arab city in a Kurdish-controlled area. So it was already out of control of the regime, minus a few like enclaves within the city. So, I mean, it was already a divided, fractured country before the war, and it still is a divided and fractured country today. It's just the biggest part of it, that Syrian heartland, has changed rulership. So that's one thing that I would definitely say. It gets confused. Syria gets confusing because there's so many different players with interest there, be they Turkey or Russia or Iran or Israel. So it's just you have to pay close attention.
It just seems like, from an outsider's perspective, Syria is in bad shape. Like, do you think that there's any positive outcome with all of this in years to come? Or do you think you'll see, you mentioned that Syria is really divided. Do you think you'll see several entities, like formal nations, come out of the one nation now? Do you think you'll see a lot more death and destruction? Like, what do we have on the horizon?
Again, it's very difficult to say, but uh, I don't want to make too many comparisons, but I remember having a conversation with an older colleague of mine, a close friend who's from Iraq, and he was saying that the feeling he has now of this ecstasy and excitement that the regime is gone is very similar to how a lot of Iraqis felt when, especially in like his northern area of Mosul, like when like Saddam fell. So there was a lot of that similar like ecstasy of this tyrant being gone, but that can very quickly change. And I would hope that Shara genuinely is reformed as he says he is, and I would hope that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham doesn't splinter into a bunch of competing fighting groups. I hope that they're able to maintain security and it doesn't devolve into like a second scale of the Syrian civil war. I'd say worst case scenario, we'd have a second stage of the Syrian civil war would be a worst case scenario. Best case scenario, there's peace and Syria is able to rebuild and restore its economy. And I think we're going to fall somewhere in between, unfortunately.
Yeah. Was there ever a moment in time where you felt like your life was seriously at risk? I know you're a very brave person and honestly, like in getting to know you while you were there, I was shocked that you just stayed there for so long. But was there ever a moment, I mean, you really are brave. I think I told you that over and
Thank
over
you.
again. But was there ever a moment where you were like, shit, I really need to get out of here. This is not good.
There was one instance like that where I was a bit nervous. So there was this was on December 8th. It was the first day, and I'd left Umayyad Square, and I was trying to go to Assad's palace. I wanted to get inside of Assad's palace, and it was barricaded off. There were checkpoints with soldiers, and I approached, and we're driving up. I'm trying to get in, and the soldiers guarding it had very distinctive uniforms, and they had a little patch with a black flag that we will all recognize. And so all these, and that's something that has not been made clear because you do see lots of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham fighters wearing patches that we in the West would recognize as the patch of the Islamic State. And I've heard people say, oh no, it's just the Shahada. And it's like the Taliban has the Shahada on their flag too, but the Taliban flag doesn't look like the ISIS flag. That's a very specific, stylized version. So I saw some soldiers at this checkpoint with these IS flags on, which again, like we talked about how there was the schism and Bashar didn't want to ally with ISIS. So, he declares allegiance with Al-Qaeda and becomes al-Nusra. So one thing I'm wondering, and nobody was really ever clear on, is why are there so many fighters within HTS who are still wearing Islamic State patches? And at the Captagon facility that we were talking about a few minutes ago, there was a guy there who was showing me his camera roll and his Snapchat memories. And he showed me a picture of him with one of those little ISIS flags on his shoulder on a patch. And he said, that's me when I was in ISIS back in 2015. So the fact that there are, Islamic State veterans who are now within HTS, some of whom are still wearing those
Veterans.
Islamic State patches, is very concerning. And I know they're wearing those patches because I saw them myself many times. Yeah. And there's one time we're approaching Assad's palace and it's all these guys with ISIS patches and we're trying to go through and we're arguing that we're journalists. And this one guy comes up to the car and he's like, Muslim? Like as a question. And he's got his ISIS patch on his plate carrier. And I'm like, no, Christian. And he's like, oh, so kafir. And he gets pissed. He's getting furious and he starts calling me a kafir. And that, for those who don't know, that means unbeliever. And I'm like, no, not kafir, Christian. Like, and he's like starts to like reach into the car, and he's like trying to open the door, and he's like keeps shouting at me that I'm a kafir, and then his commander comes up and like pushes him back, and he's like, no, Sahafi, which is Arabic for journalist. So, and then after that, we quickly sped off. So it was a little bit concerning having a guy with an Islamic State patch calling me an unbeliever, trying to get me to get out of the car, until his commander intervened on my behalf and said, no, I'm a journalist, leave me alone. So that was a little concerning, but I stayed for another month and a half after that.
Did you see any other than the images that you've shared already? Like, did you see any like brute force in front of you? Like, did you see any people being shot at or anything
No,
like this? Just
not. So again, Syria is a much larger country than Lebanon, and if there was unrest in one part of the country, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we were anywhere near it. It's like while we were there were clashes between the Syrian National Army, which is backed by Turkey, and the Syrian Democratic Forces in Manbij, and so like there were clashes up there between those two groups. Or like I mentioned earlier, there was the incident where like HTS like burned that Christmas tree in Hama, or like when the Israelis invaded in the south, and there was a protester I met who was shot through the stomach by the IDF in Quneitra. So all of these things are happening at the same time, but where I am in Damascus, there was no combat that I was able to see. And again, I mean, Damascus itself, it fell without, there's very little fighting. I mean, Damascus fell basically with no fighting. It was very easy for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to take Damascus.
Collin, you've been so generous with your time and everything today. Is there anything that we're missing? Is there a story that you'd want to highlight, or an experience that you feel needs to be shared before we finish this conversation?
Yeah, I would say it was a monumental experience, to say the least. It was one of those periods where decades worth of history can happen within a few days, and it was really both remarkable and very concerning. All the stuff we saw. I mean, a lot of the stuff we saw in Syria was horrifying and confusing, and there's so many different factions. Everything's happening all at once. And as one rebel group is taking over a country from a regime, a neighboring country is invading to expand its security apparatus. Meanwhile, another country to the north, Turkey, is attacking, the Kurds in the northeast. So it was just such a messy situation.
Collin, every guest that comes on my show ends the show with me, where I present a lead question and then they finish that question.
Okay.
It's tied into the name of the show, Some Future Day. So it kind of like plays perfectly into this episode. Are you game?
Okay. Yeah, we can give it a shot.
Okay. So I'm looking at your perspective from a wider lens, no pun intended, than just Syria and Lebanon. I mean, you really understand the lay of the land in the Middle East, or at least, from a person's perspective. Yeah, I know it's complicated, and there is a long history there too. But in Some Future Day, the geography, like the mapping of the Middle East, will look like.
I think it'll look the exact same. Nation-state borders are not going anywhere. We're unfortunately stuck with the really, really shitty borders we got from Europe after World War II.
I agree with you. I actually agree. I know a lot of people are talking about that. Those borders are going to shift a little bit over the next 4 or 5 years, but I really find that hard to believe. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
Borders are not shifting at all.
Yeah. Well, look, I appreciate it. Your experiences, tales, and stories are just so compelling. Your images are gorgeous, as everybody who's tuning in can see. And, I only wish you the best. And as I'm sure you're already thinking about your next wild ride somewhere, and I only wish you, the most safety possible, so that
Thank you.
Maybe you come back and join us again on some future day.
No, I'd be very happy to.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Some Future Day. I know your time is super valuable, so I hope you learned how you can leverage emerging technology to improve your life. And exciting news, my new book, Some Future Day, How AI is Going to Change Everything, is now available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, and other major booksellers across the globe. I am so proud to share that because of your support, the book topped the charts. It became #1 bestseller in cryptocurrency, #1 bestseller in artificial intelligence, and #1 bestseller in robotics. So, if you're curious and ready to learn how AI can enhance your career, your community, and your family, get yourself a copy today.